So guys, welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about renowned activist, Mr. Lumumba. He's a Kenyan lawyer, well, former Kenyan lawyer. He's an anti-corruption activist on the continent. And in this speech, he gave a speech at this year at the Africa Central Bank conference. And he's basically saying that Africa should forego the US dollar and have one currency and have a central bank, so they can go step by step with Africa. Africa can go step by step with America when it comes on to currency wise, and this will elevate the continent on a level unforeseen. And also in this speech, he's relaying how the former Prime Minister of England, Tony Blair, said that Africa is a scar on the world, but yet fast forward a few years later, he's giving counsel to some African leaders and to bankers of that do business in Africa. He's now a counselor, giving counsel to these people, and yet he says Africa is a scourge on the world. So let's listen to this speech and how we explain why Africa should forego the US dollar and so forth and so on, and why these leaders must work for Africa instead of working for themselves. So let's take a listen to this lecture and listen to it in its entirety. Let me know what you think about it in the comment section. So let's get it on. Boom.
You will see the former Prime Minister of Britain called Mr. Tony Blair. One time in 1980 he said that Africa is a scar on the conscience of the world. One of the most painful statements I've ever heard, condescending. And any sensible Africa took umbrage. Today, Tony Blair is the advisor of many African countries. And some of you will come from central banks where Tony Blair is advising. Do you think he advises your central bank for your benefit? No, he cannot. He does it for the benefit of his country. And do I begrudge him? No. Every country does what is in their best interest. You who are here and are from Africa, in front of whom there are African flags, are you doing it for your countries? Are you doing it for your countries? Or you are going through the motions? Is this just yet another workshop which will lengthen your curriculum vitae? Because this is serious business. You who are bankers, you asked me to talk about corruption. I refuse to talk about corruption because that is the stereotypical narrative that is used to undermine the confidence of Africa. Corruption is manufactured from outside. There was a time when the French, when they are dealing with Africa, then corruption was considered as a business expense. And the money that is derived from corruption is kept in Guernsey and those other islands where there are no taxes. It's not in Africa. Switzerland is the home of all corrupt money in the world until very recently. Yet when you see the Swiss, you think they are angels freshly baked from heaven. And yet all African kleptocrats keep their money in Switzerland, midwifed by yourselves, who are in the banking sector. Because this money is not carried in lorries. It passes through your banking systems in numbered accounts or some other media through your banking system. What are you doing about that? I'm suggesting to us that you African bankers who are present here, there is corruption, but it takes two to tango, if you allow me to use that cliche. And therefore, on an occasion such as this, as we look to Africa and look to use her resources for our benefit, and as we talk about Africa being present in a globalized world, we must begin to understand and to define these globalized terms in a manner that addresses our key interests as African continent. And I'm not suggesting for one moment that we exclude ourselves from the world. We are part of the world. But yet there is a sense in which we must look at the local realities and do that which is in our best interest. Former President of the United States of America, Ronald Reagan, once said, and I agree with him, America does what is in her best interest unapologetically. Do I begrudge them? No. Do we Africans do what is in our best interest? No. We must now begin to do what is in our best interest. If Standard Bank is in South Africa or in any of our countries, we as central bankers in those countries, do we make them do things that are in our best interest, even as they want to make profit? Or we say it was registered 66 years ago, or it can do no wrong? Ladies and gentlemen, you are doing a great job. But despite the best intention of the best of you, given the international economic and financial architecture, you'll never make Africa realize our potential until pigs fly. And the last time I checked, they are not just about to fly. Which means, therefore, that we must go to the basics. And what are the basics? Ha-Joon Chang, in his book, The Bad Samaritan, appears to make prescriptions which I think are commendable. He says that if you look at the history of all the countries in the West, at critical times in their growth, they did certain things that immunized them from external vagaries. Do we do so in Africa? No, we don't. If you look at China, which is now rising, and India, which are now rising, they ring-fenced a few things for their own benefit. Do we in Africa do so? No, we don't. If you look at the emerging Arab countries, which you now see the Emiratis or the Bahrainis or Brunei or Darussalam, you can see they do that. If you look at little Singapore, they are doing that. Do we? No, we don't. We still wait for the almighty IMF to tell us things. And then we say, oh, almighty IMF and World Bank, we have had you. When IMF sneezes, our economy goes into a coma. When we want to test our economies, who do we go to? Moody's. Depending on how moody Moody's are, our economies are equally moody. When we want to measure our economies, which indices do we use? GDP. Ladies and gentlemen, the time is now, therefore, for us to begin to assess what it is that we must do as I conclude. And I'm suggesting that the time is now for African central banks to begin to work intimately with organizations such as SADC, initially, with organizations such as East African Community or ECOWAS, for the purpose of beginning to harmonize our economies and having regulatory frameworks that enable trade to happen in a seamless way. The time is now for African central banks to begin to work closely with the African Union under the aegis of the Africa Agenda 2063 as a necessary facilitator to Africa Continental Free Trade Area, that we must begin to do things that are going to inform the African agenda within the African economic and financial ecosystem. The time is now that we must begin to ensure that we de-dollarize our economy. The Americans don't want to hear this. That we must begin to de-dollarize our economies. Because as long as our economies are dollarized, it means that the externalities are affecting our very being. Right now in Kenya, if you want dollars, they can't give you more than $5,000. The same in Ghana. And when we do that, whichever currency we create will stand toe to toe with the American dollar. Then you will talk about trade. The time is now that we must begin to interrogate the role of banks which were meant to be Pan-Africa, such as the African Development Bank. I know many of you now know the second largest investor in the African Development Bank, paradoxically and ironically, is the United States of America. And the other one, of course, is Japan, African Development Bank. During the appointment of their last head, the Americans even wanted to veto his appointment, African Development Bank. Institutions such as the African Development Bank must now be made to be true African Development Bank that relates with other banks from a position of strength. If we do so, ladies and gentlemen, then the central banking that you are talking about will be central banking that informs the African environment. Let us not wait for Europe and America to give us terminologies in the financial sector. I heard it being said, KYC, know your customer. If tomorrow Europe and America comes up with another acronym, you'll now begin to change. I'm suggesting that we must begin to churn out some of these terms that are relevant to our own circumstances. Kwame Nkrumah was right 60 years ago when he said, if you are not economically and financially independent, then the independence you are talking about is of no value. He was right when he said that Africa will only be truly independent if she controls our resources and our banking sectors. He was right when he said that Africans must harmonize their financial policy. He was right when he said that Africa will only begin to be respected if her finances are controlled by her. He was right when he said that in financial relations in the world, the rule is still the law of the jungle.